Presidential Wealth Management. On this edition of the Eagle's Nest webinar, Dr. Michael Busler, economist, public policy analyst, and professor of finance, answers questions about what the economic recovery may look like. Since the government hit the brakes on our economy, 33 million Americans have filed for unemployment benefits. And with that, we all have a lot of questions. What does the economic recovery look like? Will it be like Fast and Furious, or will it take years? And how will it change our lives? How will it change our lives possibly permanently? In this Eagle's Nest webinar, we're going to put those questions, our questions, and your questions to Dr. Michael Busler, economist, public policy analyst, and professor of finance at Stockton University in New Jersey. Dr. Busler, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for joining us. First things first, how are you and your family making it through this?
Well, thank you for having me, Keith. It's my pleasure to be here. We're doing real well. I live in southern New Jersey, while northern New Jersey is like New York City, and it's been clobbered. Southern New Jersey, especially the resorts along the beach where I live, we've had very, very few cases. I think in the two southern counties, there's only about 1,000 cases and less than 100 fatalities. That's why I've been pushing the governor to reopen the Jersey Shore as early as next week. So some of these small businesses don't get clobbered by missing their summer season. They've already missed what we call the shoulder season, which is from Easter, April and May. We call that the shoulder season. People come down on the weekends and you get some business, but starting in Memorial Day is really when the season happens for them. And I'm trying to get them open by next week so they can be prepared for the following weekend, is Memorial Day weekend. I don't think I'm going to be successful, but I'm trying.
Well, it's good to know you and your family are doing well.
Yes, we are. Thank you. I appreciate your asking.
In the next few minutes, we are going to learn what the economic recovery might look like. We're going to learn the challenges our markets are going to face as that happens, and how we as a nation will rebound from COVID-19. I'm Keith Weinman with Taylor Leary from Presidential Wealth Management.
Keith, Dr. Michael Busler, thank you for being on with us today. A couple of housekeeping items that we want to review, just so I know a lot of folks that are on today have been on in the past, but for those that are new, we've got a menu item here on the side that I will talk about as we go through. The first thing I want to bring to light is the chat box. So there is a chat feature, and so we want to make this as interactive as possible. And so with that, the chat feature is a great way to send your questions about what's going on or what's top of mind as it relates to the economy. Yes, the market is a very big thing, but what's going on in your head, and what are the questions that you have about our economy and the next step and next phases of our recovery? So with that said, use the chat feature. Again, this chat feature is going to be private in nature. So not everybody's going to see it. Only the hosts, myself, Keith, and Dr. Michael Busler are going to be able to see this. And so we'll be able to talk to that. So if you feel a little sheepish, maybe a little silly about asking questions, there is no silly or stupid questions. Everything is good, because if you've got it, I know that there are many people out there with the exact same questions, and we are just so fortunate to have that opportunity to ask an expert today. So use the chat feature, stay engaged. We'll do our best to answer any questions that you might have, but keep that in mind. The next area that I want to point to is the polls question, or the polls tab. We will introduce polls throughout the day as they are necessary and as we deem appropriate. So another great way to stay engaged with this conversation is through the polls. We love to hear what your thoughts, your insights are on what's going on out there. So use the poll as a way to stay engaged in today's conversation.
Dr. Busler, Taylor and I and you have talked about somewhat of a format, and you're an economist, and we hope to get a basic economics lesson from you in the first part of this discussion, and then learn about how it relates to our lives and even perhaps the markets. But I cannot resist the opportunity to blow it up right out of the box. Something I saw, a piece that I picked up in the news just yesterday, and your reaction to this. Sam Zell, billionaire for buying troubled real estate, says that the corona pandemic will leave the same kind of impact on the economy and society as the Great Depression did 80 years ago, with long-lasting changes in human behavior that imperil many business models. Zell expects social distancing and working from home will persist long after the outbreak is over. Retail, hospitality, travel, education, live entertainment, and professional sports will continue to struggle for years and years. Sam Zell's nickname is the Grave Dancer. With that in mind, your reaction to his comments.
Yeah, I pretty much disagree with that. And starting from the very beginning, he said that after this, we come out of this, we'll have some long-term negative impacts, much like we did in the Depression. Now, why do I disagree with that? The Depression essentially lasted 10 years. It started early in the 30s. We actually were coming out of it, and then we went back into it after they decided to pass the Social Security Act. We went back into it, lasted 10 years, and it did have some long-term impacts. The current situation, while very deep, is not going to be very long-lasting. So let me talk a little bit about the big picture here. So we started off this year in great shape. January and February started off so well. I thought that this year would see the highest growth rate we've seen in decades. It's been since the year 2000 that we've seen 4% growth. The year 2005, since annual growth has exceeded 3%. I was looking for a 3.5% to 4% growth this year. The table was set for that. January and February looked great. Of course, then the virus came. In mid-March, we had to shut the economy down completely. It's still shut down and just starting to reopen now. As a result of March being shut down, GDP in the first quarter didn't show growth, rather almost a 5% drop in real GDP. The second quarter, we're probably going to see a 20 to 25% drop in GDP. Now, that's depression-sized numbers. However, the question is, what do we think of the recovery? So there are four scenarios economists talk about for a recovery. One is what we call, and what the president is and his advisors say, will be a V-shaped recovery, which means it drops down and then comes back very quickly. That's a V-shaped recovery. Most economists favor what we call U-shaped recovery, where it drops down, takes a little while to get going again, and then finally starts back up again. There is an L-shaped recovery, which is what happened after 2009. The economy went down, and then it stayed pretty low for nearly a decade, really until 2017, when it finally started to come up again. So that's an L. The last letter, so we're V, U, L. The last letter is W. So what's W? The economy goes down, bounces up, but then the virus flares up again in the fall. We have to shut the economy down, and it goes down again and then recovers. So there are four choices for recoveries. Which one is the most likely? I think either the V or the U is most likely. Now, why do I say that? When you're looking at prior recessions, there was a reason for it. You had a financial crisis. You had problems in the 20s, which led to the depression in the 30s. This time, there was no reason for a recession except the government told everybody to stop working. Now, once people go back to work, which is starting now. And I think by middle of June, you'll see more states opening up. By the end of June, you'll probably have 75 to 80% of the states opened. By the end of May, rather, by mid-June, everything except maybe New York City and a couple hot spots will be opened. Now, they won't be fully open because we'll still observe some social distancing. We'll still have some wearing some face masks, that sort of thing. So the impact that'll have on things like sporting events, like they're doing in South Korea today, they're playing baseball to an empty stadium, although they paint figures of people in the stands, which I thought was interesting. But so we may start with sports like that. What this will depend upon, one day in July, I think we're going to pick up the newspaper and it's going to say, yesterday, there was no new cases of the coronavirus anywhere in the country. Once you get that for a couple of days, even if it flares up again afterwards, people will feel more confident. And once they feel more confident, they'll feel more like going back to what we had prior to this. And consumer confidence is extremely important because the first 3 years of the current administration, the economy did extremely well, mostly because of the consumer sector, and consumer confidence was sky high at record levels, and it should be. For the last year and a half, there were more job openings than there were unemployed people. There were over 7 million, 7.5 million, depending on what month you look, job openings, and about 6 million unemployed people. So anybody who had any kind of a skill and could do anything could get a good job. Wages were going up at the fastest rate in decades. Inflation was very low, so you got a real increase in purchasing power. So consumers felt better. They felt wealthier. The money they had in their retirement accounts that was in the stock market, that was going up in value. So again, that made them feel wealthier. Their incomes were good. Inflation was low. Interest rates were low. Regulations had been eliminated. They'd just gotten a tax cut, which increased disposable income. So consumers were feeling very confident, and it caused the economy to have that growth spurt. So it's important we get that confidence back. Go ahead.
Just one follow-up to that. So then you're assuming that we will get control of the Corona-19, and that we will not have what will constitute a comeback in the fall, right, which many are still talking about.
Right. Now, I'm not a medical professional, so I don't know if that's what's going to happen. What I do know is that they're working extremely hard at trying to come up with therapeutics, and that remdesivir begins with an R, that Gilead had very successful results with. There's some other things, very successful results. I think there are 70 companies working on a vaccine for this. Now, it takes some time. The researchers at Oxford University in London, they think by September they're going to have a vaccine. I don't know if they will or not. The president is shooting for the first of the year. A lot of this depends upon getting consumer confidence, and that will depend upon getting this virus under control. But as hard as we're working on this, and with American ingenuity, I think we're going to be able to get this under control by the fall. And although our lifestyle may be a little different, I think that's only going to be short term. I think by January, we should be able to get back to a more normal lifestyle. Now, let me just add one point. There are some things that are going to change. Everybody is working remotely. And people are saying, this working remotely may not be such a bad idea. I actually get more work done when I'm working remote. I don't have to get dressed up. I don't have to travel to get to work. I don't have to talk at the office water cooler with everybody. So you may see some changes in how business is done. I do some consulting work for some startup companies, mostly in the software field. This is the way they operate routinely. They can work from anywhere. Everything's done on a computer, and they have very lax schedules. They don't have to go to the office. They can work from home, and this is very routine for them. I think that's going to carry over to the mainstream into the future.
Yeah, well, you say that, and as we're talking, I can hear my little 24-pound meatball of a French bulldog scratching the floor, and now he's broken in. So there's definitely some disruptions, but I would definitely say that the working from home transition for our company has been remarkably good. And I think that, there was a thing, a little soundbite from the CEO, I believe, of Morgan Stanley, who said, he said, if you told me on January 1st that in the second quarter, 90% of my workforce would be working from home, I'd tell you to count them. And that's just the unbelievable, and speaks to the unbelievable nature of basically, the US. I think we give ourselves a lot of pats on the back in that regard, but it's well deserved, to be clear. One of the interesting things that we talk about the letters. We talk about I call this the alphabet soup financial recovery or economic recovery, because everybody wants to make this simple. They want to make simple sense of this. It's that narrative bias that we have, or that, where, hey, let's fit this round peg in the round hole just because it's easy. This is complex in nature. So over the last 4 weeks, now I understand you're an economist, not a market, you don't speak to the markets. We've seen the market rebound unbelievably, 26, 27%, and I'm using the S&P and the Dow in this. We saw just today that the NASDAQ turned positive for the year. So what I look at is maybe I might go the third rail and say, let's throw out the alphabet soup or the English alphabet, and could we go Latin? Could we be looking at, from a market perspective and an economic perspective, more like mu, where we've got the up and then we've got a drop, and then it's more like a U-shaped, where, what do you sense? And again, I'm not trying to put you in a spot where you feel uncomfortable talking about the stock market, but oftentimes people correlate the stock market and the economic environment kind of as the same. Where do you see things going, and is that a driver in your world?
Yeah, so here's what I see. I'm a finance professor. So when I teach how stock prices come, there's a zillion variables that go into that. But basically, when you buy stock, the price you're willing to pay is based on your expectations of future earnings for the corporation. So if the stock market feels the economy was going to tank and corporate profits would go down, then they say, let me sell my stocks before that happens, and that's what draws the market down. So many economists say sometimes the market is an indicator of future economic activity. Now, you might argue maybe that's what happened now. The stock market, looking at the Dow, went from 29,000 down to 19,000. That was about a 37% drop, I think was the exact number, in a very short time period. So the stock market was saying, we think the economy is going to tank this year. Some of it may have been a little bit of overreaction, because remember back then they were saying 1 to 2 million people could die, and this could shut down the economy for the rest of the year. And so some of it may have been an overreaction. But then the stock market said, I think we're going to get through this. And when we do, I think we'll be okay getting through this, and we'll get back to growth. So it dropped down and it went back up. Now it's recovered more than 50% of the loss, and we're still in the recession portion. So that big increase is perhaps an indication the market believes the recovery will be fairly robust.
Yeah, I'll just be very curious after, we talk about the summer doldrums, and that when we see volumes start to dry up a little bit from the trading volumes, and then the volatility increases, and that's using the farmer's almanac, that's kind of a typical approach to the markets. Do you see a dip down from where we are right now?
No. I'm very optimistic. As the economy continues to grow, and again, I favor that V shape, maybe a little bit of a U, but so things are starting to open up now, and I think by the end of June, everything will be open, most of which will be open, I think, by the end of May. Again, there'll be some restrictions, and that's the U part, because it may take time to get up to 100% capacity. But I think the third quarter of this year, we're going to see some growth. And I think the fourth quarter, we're going to see some real good growth. Next year, I think this, again, assuming we get the virus under control medically, next year, I think we could see some of the best growth we've had in years. Look, the stage is set for it. Regulations have been eliminated. The federal government is giving out free money to everybody. Anybody who paid taxes last year or the year before got a $1,200 check. If you have a family of four, it's a $3,400 check. Whether you've been affected negatively by this situation or not, you got that extra money. Well, that gives people extra money to spend. Second thing, as part of the stimulus package, you just mentioned 33 million people are unemployed. Your income goes from wherever you're making it down to whatever unemployment's paying you, usually 30 to 40% of what you were making, except the federal government just gave everybody an extra $600 a week until the end of July. I just talked to somebody who said, I hope they never call me back. I'm making more money now than I was making when I'm working. And that's a little bit of a danger. And that's what's going to keep unemployment from dropping as quickly as we'd like it, because people are going to be reluctant to go back to work. Yeah. But still, they gave them money that'll get them through any hardship, and again, give them money to spend when the economy reopens. The third thing they did was they want to make sure small business stays in business. So the government said, and they set aside $600 billion for this. They said, look, to any small business, we'll lend you money to pay all of your wages for the next 2 months and some of your other expenses. If you don't lay anybody off, the loan turns into a grant, so you don't have to pay it back. So I told everybody, every small business I do work with, I said, go apply for this. And they said, okay, I'll get it, but I have to keep the people working. I'm not even opened yet. I don't know when I'm going to open. I said, it doesn't matter. Call everybody back, bring them in. If there's no business, get them to improve your business. If you're a restaurant, come up with new recipes, figure out new table arrangements, do something to make your business better. But you're not paying for this. The government's paying their wages for you. So just get them employed. When we finally open up, then you'll be all set to go, and the economy can then take off. There may be social distancing and probably only operate at 50% of capacity for a while, but still. So since the government gave everybody free money, they gave the unemployed people probably more money than they were making when they were employed, and they gave small business enough money to pay their wages for the next 2 months. Once everybody says it's okay to open up the economy, I expect things to take off, especially once we can open up at full capacity.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a fascinating conversation, because in one side of it, it's like, yes, this is an amazing opportunity for businesses, and it's gonna lend to that or bridge the gap here of this economic challenge. So at the end of March, when President Trump signed into law the CARES Act, he basically opened the floodgates, right, to individuals, businesses, even government institutions. I mean, state and local governments.
Right. They got some money too. Yeah.
Over fist. So when we see the Federal Reserve then cut rates to zero and go back to basically, 2010, 2009 era, and then all of a sudden now we're talking about even more stimulus, there's, the gavel's being hit like more. And it feels like, we're pumping the system full of a lot of money right now. And so my question to you is, we've started to hear that maybe there's some pushback. So just in the last day or so, there's been some lawmakers that say, whoa, I get that we need to have these economic packages or the stimulus packages passed, and we need to provide that safety net, if you will, for those small businesses. Is throwing more money at this thing in the short term, or rather in the long term, massively detrimental? And what does that ultimately do to our economic standing, not only, I guess, just on our balance sheet, but as a world power?
It is detrimental. I don't think we need any more stimulus. Look, the government is pumping $3 trillion into the economy, giving out all that free money. We only have a $21 trillion economy, so that's a big chunk of money you're putting in there. In my view, that's more than enough to stimulate the economy. I don't favor anything more. And why is that? Prior to the virus, the federal government budget for this year was to spend $4.7 trillion and to bring in $3.7 trillion in taxes. So you had a $1 trillion deficit this year. They just agreed to spend $3 trillion more. That takes the deficit up to $4 trillion just for the year. Plus, because the economy was shut down, tax revenue was going to go down, probably by 3 or 4, maybe 500 billion. We're looking at a $4 to $5 trillion deficit this year alone. That gets added to the public debt. The public debt, which is the accumulation of all deficits, is 23 trillion. So we're going to add another 4 to that, gets it up to 27 trillion. Is that a problem? Most economists will say, as long as the debt is less than 1 year's GDP, you're okay. Once it gets above 1 year's GDP, you're going to run into problems. GDP is 21 trillion. The debt will be 27 trillion. It's way above 1 year's GDP. So what's the problem with that? A couple things. One, the interest expense alone is already 400 billion a year and climbing. And remember, we're at low interest rates now. These have to get refinanced. We'll be at higher interest rates. So there's the interest payment that has to be made. The second thing we're afraid of is the government doing all that borrowing might crowd out business. So there might not be any funds available to business if the government is taking it all. Now, the Federal Reserve has gotten around that by figuratively printing new money. In other words, the Federal Reserve has bought some of those bonds, and they don't actually print dollars. It's all done electronically. But so they actually create more money. That too is very inflationary. You have too many dollars chasing too few goods, and we're going to have an inflationary problem. So I wouldn't go any further with any more spending. Let's see how this thing plays out. If we need a little more later, we may, but I wouldn't go any further, and I'd start to work on looking at the deficit as soon as we can.
Michael, Karen via the chat box just asked a question. Aren't the taxpayers where the buck stops? Eventually, don't the taxpayers pay in some way for that $3 billion that's been handed out?
Every penny of it. So the federal government doesn't have any money. All they have is what they get from taxpayers or what they borrow in a taxpayer's name. So when you say you want the government to pay for something, you're asking for taxpayers to pay for it, or you're asking for the government to borrow money to pay for it. Let me just make one point about the borrowing. The reason the borrowing gets me so irked is there's no mechanism in place to ever pay this back. There's no way to ever pay this money back. So we borrow the money, we pay interest every year. It's a 10-year bond. We pay interest every year. The bond matures in 10 years. How do we pay it back? We sell a new bond to pay back the old bond. You roll over the debt. That's why the public debt keeps going up and doesn't ever come down. Now, the only time we reduced the deficit, the public debt at all, was in 1997 up to the year 2000, when we had a surplus in the budget. And why did we have a surplus in the budget? Newt Gingrich said, I have a contract with America, we're not spending. President Clinton said, and his exact words were, the era of big government is over. And he reduced government spending. He also cut the capital gains tax from 28% to 20%. That stimulated economic growth. We averaged 4.5% annual growth for those 4-year period, brought in a lot of tax revenue. We cut down on spending. You actually had a surplus in the budget. And for those 4 years, we were able to work some of the debt down. Otherwise, there's no mechanism in place to pay it back.
Go ahead.
To where this money is going. All right. So, and it's definitely the line is the aisle in Congress, and on one side you have basically the Democrats saying, get more money in the hands of the individual. They're going to be spending it more. They need it more. And then you have kind of the other party that's saying, you know what, we need to give this money to the businesses. It's because the businesses are what drive those individuals to work and do all these things. Where do we draw the line? What is good?
Well, so what happened in the CARES package that was just passed? They gave money to everybody, money to the unemployed, and they gave money to business. So that I think they came up with a perfect compromise. We put the hand, everybody got a $1,200 check, almost everybody got a $1,200 check in their checking account. Mine was just that people just direct deposit. So you had extra money. Again, whether you were negatively impacted or not, you have extra money to spend. So the money is now in our hands. The unemployed people are getting that extra $600 a week. The money is in their hand, and small business is getting loans that could turn into grants. So the money is in their hands. So they satisfied both, and which I think was the right thing to do. You want to stimulate demand by giving people money to spend. You want to make sure you can respond to the increase in demand by increasing supply, and you can only do that if businesses have the ability to increase the supply, which is exactly what they did. I think they did more than they should have, at least enough. We don't need to go any further. Let this filter through, and if in another month or two it looks like we still have some problems, we'll deal with that.
All right. So then my follow-up question, and then I'll punt it over to Keith there. And so 2008, 2009, kind of rewind the tape here and look at what happened then. We saw this massive upheaval. The story. The real estate bubble
crisis, right?
The financial crisis, and what was interesting is the delay and how long it really took for the federal government to react to what was going on, for the feds to come in and really kind of put their stamp on things and make changes. We then went through a period through the Obama administration, whether that was right or wrong, that we put some changes in place where, the too big to fail stuff, the Dodd-Frank things and some regulations in place that would basically say, we don't want to see that happen again where we're that under the gun. And we saw that the response to that was pretty, or the response to this latest, the coronavirus was amazing, and it was very quick. Do you think that was driven because there was no bad actor per se? Or do you believe that it was, how do I say this? Do you think that things that happened back in 2010 and 2011 with some of those changes, do you think that aided our quick response to the economic crisis we've seen over the last 8 weeks?
So I think the difference between what happened in 2009 going forward and what's happening now, there are two things. One, we have a president who's a business person. He's not a politician. The politicians have to do things very politically correctly, deal with one side, deal with the other side, go through different changes, take a year or two to have conferences, do what you have to do. And that's how politicians work. Business people confront problems immediately, especially if they're impacting your bottom line. And that's what President Trump did. He's a business person. He confronted the problem. You don't have enough ventilators? I'll get people to make ventilators who used to make cars. You don't have enough surgical masks? I'll get a guy who used to make pillows to make surgical masks. And before you know it, a month or two later, we're making more than we need. So a business person knows what to do. A politician does not. Second thing, in 2009, the top priority of the administration should have been increase economic growth and get us out of this thing. And that's what President Trump's focus is on, get us economic growth and get us out of this. The Obama administration, their primary goal was to cure perceived social injustices. It's injustice everybody doesn't have health care. It's injustice big banks take advantage of consumers. It's injustice CEOs make so much money. It's injustice that unskilled workers don't make enough money. So every time they tried to cure a perceived social injustice, it slowed economic growth. For instance, they passed the Affordable Care Act. 20 million Americans get health insurance, and they tout that as being good, and I suppose that is good. However, the other 285 million of us that were paying for our health insurance before now have to pay for our own insurance, plus those 20 million people that you just added. So that reduced disposable income for consumers that earned income. That tended to slow economic growth. But what really slowed growth was President Obama in the bill said any employer of at least 50 employees has to offer health insurance to their every employee, or pay a $3,000 fine. That adds to the cost of business, tends to slow economic growth. I can't hire people now because I have to pay all these things, and now it's too expensive to hire workers. That tends to slow economic growth. The Affordable Care Act had 21 either new or increased taxes in it. Every time you raise taxes, consumers ultimately pay the taxes. Every time you raise them, it reduces your disposable income, reduces your consumption, and therefore reduces demand and tends to slow economic growth. So the Affordable Care Act, socially, it did help 20 million people. Economically, it was a disaster. How about the Dodd-Frank bill? So they believe the financial crisis was caused because people went in and applied for mortgages. They shouldn't have gotten the mortgages. The banks shouldn't have given it to them. The reason the banks did give it to them was banks don't keep mortgages. They make the mortgages, you package them in groups of 10 or 20, sell them to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac said, we're buying mortgages where people are putting no down payment and have a very low interest rate, a teaser rate, we call it, for the first year. That's the only way these people would qualify. So the banks just did what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac said they were buying. The Obama administration viewed that as predatory lending. The banks were taking advantage of consumers, even though consumers freely applied for these. Banks didn't hold a gun to your head and say, apply for a mortgage. They freely applied for this, but they said the banks had a responsibility not to do business with them and decline the mortgage. They only did it because they were acting as predators on these people. So they passed Dodd-Frank to make sure lending like that won't happen again. The problem is it reduced all lending. The regulations were so tough. Banks had very difficult time making any kinds of loans. If there's no bank lending, there's no multiplying effect of monetary policy. What does that mean? So the Federal Reserve increases the money supply by increasing reserves. They pump money into the economy. You want the money to have a multiplying effect so it grows. How do you do that? The banks get the money, they make a loan, somebody takes out a loan, spends it on something, that customer then has money to put in the bank has more money to lend, and it multiplies. If the banks aren't lending money, there's no multiplying effect of monetary policy. And that's why the money supply exploded with that quantitative easing back in 2010 and 11, but it didn't increase economic growth. Everybody says, well, monetary policy doesn't work. It does work, but it didn't work then because the banking laws you passed slowed down. Economists refer to this as the velocity of money. You slowed down the amount of turnover and multiplying effect of money, and that's why it didn't work. President Trump repealed the negative part of the Dodd-Frank bill. So now it's easier for banks to make loans. Now, when the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, you will get more of a multiplying effect and things will grow. So the difference is we have a business person and not a politician, and monetary policy will be much more effective than it was. The third difference is, as you said before, put the hands into the money of consumers. We have these big tax cuts in 2018. The stimulus package puts money into hands of consumers, and that should help. The stimulus package, the Obama administration had sort of targeted key industries. They wanted to do infrastructure. They said, look, there are shovel-ready jobs. And then a year later or 2 years later, he said, well, I guess the shovel-ready jobs weren't as shovel-ready as we thought. Again, that's a politician dealing with money rather than a business person. So I think the effect this time will be far different than it was in 2009, 10.
4 rapid-fire questions here. Number 1, from where they are now, are taxes more likely to go up, down, or stay the same?
It's all political. So it depends who wins the election in November. If President Trump wins, the tendency will be to reduce taxes. If Joe Biden, the presumptive nominee, wins, the tendency will be to raise taxes. Let me just say, the Democrats are saying, look, you cut taxes and created a huge deficit. According to the Congressional Budget Office, $2 trillion you've added to the public debt by cutting taxes, and all went to the wealthy, is what the Democrats say. That's absolutely not true. The tax cut, and I want this to be very emphatic when I say it, the tax cut did not add 1 penny to the deficit. The tax cut did not add 1 penny to the deficit. Why do I say that? In 2018, the tax cut went into effect. We took in more tax dollars in 2018 than we did in 2017. We took in more tax dollars in 2019 than we did in 2018. So the deficit is not due to tax revenue going down. It's due to spending going up so much. Now, let me just answer one other question. Samuel, well, why is everybody saying that the tax cut led to deficits in the debt? So what their argument is, they say, look, you lowered the tax rates and still took in more money. Had you not lowered the rates and the economy grew, you would have been taxing at a higher rate. You would have brought in more money. So you did bring in more than last year, but you would have brought in even more had you not cut the taxes. That's their argument back to me. Now, my argument back to them is you wouldn't have gotten the kind of growth you got unless you cut the taxes. So your argument that it would have been, I mean, who knows what it would have been, and I don't think it would have been. The facts are we took in more revenue in 18 than we did in 17. We took in more tax revenue in 19 than we did in 18. If you lower the tax rate but bring in more revenue, tax cuts don't create a deficit. I know I'm ranting here. Let me just say one more thing. When Bill Clinton cut the capital gain from 28 to 20%, tax revenue from the capital gain went up significantly because at the lower rate, there was so much more activity. You had a lower rate, but you're taxing more dollars, so the total revenue goes up. So what's going to happen to taxes? It depends on who wins the election. Trump, they're going to head down. Biden, they're going to end up going up, and we'll have to see what happens with the election.
Number two, this could be a yes or no, but people wonder.
Sorry if I'm ranting here.
That's all right. But this one could be very simple because people wonder, will we see negative interest rates in the United States?
I don't think ever. I don't think we'll ever see negative interest rates. The interest rates have bottomed. They're at 0.25%. I don't think they're going to go any lower than that. I don't think we'll see negative. The trend in interest rates, although I don't think it will start at the earliest until sometime next year, will be for interest rates to go up, not down.
10-year Treasury currently running at around 0.5%, give or take.
Or less. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that controls a lot of rates that consumers pay. It doesn't control, but it influences mortgage rates, for example.
Yeah.
Do you see it staying there for a while?
Yeah, I'm telling everybody, this is probably, as soon as you can go out and look at houses, and I know that all these open houses are called off, but if you're thinking about buying a house, they're advertising 30-year mortgages at under 3%. 15-year mortgages are close to 2.5%. You're not going to see that for a while. Home prices have stopped their rise. I haven't seen them soften much, but they're not going up as much as they used to. I think this is a great time to buy a house. Housing inventory is a little bit low now for a number of reasons. So I'm telling people, if you're thinking about buying a house, sometime in the next 3-4 months is probably the best time to do it because rates are so favorable.
Okay. And then number 4, the Fed has gone on record saying they will keep interest rates near zero until the economy reaches full employment and 2% inflation. Could you see that happening over the next, say, 2 years?
The full employment part, I'm not sure about. The 2% inflation, I'm a little nervous about. That could end up coming a little quicker than we'd like to see. I do think the unemployment rate is going to drop nearly as fast as it went up in the last month or so. Now, tomorrow morning, they're going to give the unemployment rate for the country. Mm-hmm. I'm figuring around 21, 22%. Now, we'll see what they come up with, and that's going to shock everybody. But it wasn't caused by any economic factors. It was caused by the government just shutting things down. So if the government starts opening things up, people will come back to work, except for the ones that are getting the extra $600 in their paycheck. They're not going to want to come back to work. But everybody else should be willing to come back to work. And I see that unemployment rate dropping quickly. Now, the second thing is, how do you define full employment? Historically, that was when unemployment was around 5%. Mm-hmm. But we got unemployment down to 3.5%. So maybe the 5's not right. So I'm not sure how they'll define it. I have a feeling when it gets down to the 5-6% range, with the economy growing healthy, they're going to start to raise interest rates again. I think that could be about a year to a year and a half away.
So this is maybe outside of the scope of where we were going, but I just want to get your take on kind of the macro view of the world. So it brought to light to me that this was this is a generational event that we just have experienced over the last 8 to 10 weeks or so. And that is across the world, we are seeing economies, governments shut down their economies, governments going into the social distancing, the quarantine, all of these things, these measures that are just absolutely decimating our economic landscape for the short term, at least. This is a shared experience that I'm experiencing here in Denver. Somebody that's in New York is experiencing this. Somebody in Amsterdam is experiencing. All over the world, we're having this shared experiences that's never happened in my generation, and I would even say in the baby boomer generation, or even anybody living right now. There's been no shared experience like we're seeing today. So with that, the response to that, you see responses that Sweden's been on the hot seat, if you will, about their response and how they're handling it. Good, bad, or indifferent doesn't really matter. Then you see like a New Zealand who has very few cases of COVID. How do you look at the response from these government entities as it relates to their economy being very different, and how does that affect our world economy if Thomas Friedman is right and the world is flat? How do we respond to different and cultural phenomena that's very different across the world?
So what's come out of this, I think, on the good side is there's less hostility between countries now, and there is a tendency to want to try to help each other. Since we've produced so many ventilators, Governor Cuomo in New York said he's going to need 30,000 ventilators. So President Trump starts making them real fast. He doesn't need anywhere near that. So now we have a lot of ventilators, but which we're starting to help, which is good. So with the economy, most of the world follows what the U.S. does. And when we start recovering and they see what we're doing to recover, they're likely to do something very similar to that. They tend to lag the U.S. by about 6 months from an economic standpoint. Now, in terms of fundamental changes, up until this, there was the view that free trade is good and global economies are good, and most economists continue to believe that's true. However, one of the disadvantages of that is you become dependent on another country for output of certain key goods. So what's happening, I think, what will fundamental change, companies are not going to make as many things in China as they've been making. Pharmaceutical products, for one, surgical masks, those kind of things, medical things that are vital, they're going to bring back production to the U.S. Now, the next thing you'll say to me is, well, that's going to drive the cost way up. I mean, the reason they're in China in the first place is a U.S. manufacturing worker makes, $25 an hour. They make $1 an hour over there, and they're good workers. So it's much cheaper to make it over there than it is here. If you bring it back here, you're going to be cost prohibitive. The answer to that is we have to take away China's advantage. So we'll bring the manufacturing back. Instead of it being labor intensive, you have a lot of people working there, it'll be capital intensive. So instead of 100 workers producing 100 units of output, you'll have 10 workers, 90 robots. Using artificial intelligence and more automation, you'll be able to get the cost down. Fortunately, that's a capital intensive rather than labor intensive. Fortunately, when Congress cut taxes in 2018, they cut taxes for the middle class to stimulate demand, which was good. They also cut taxes for the highest income earners and corporations. That's where the new capital comes from. So now corporations have capital, wealthy investors have capital. When we bring the manufacturing back and we need new capital to set up these capital intensive manufacturing facilities, we're going to have it there. China is going to hurt as a result of this, especially if it comes out that they weren't completely forthright with their information in the beginning.
Dr. Busler, a thought you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, as dismal as things may look today, we will get through this. We will return to normal with some adjustments. I have complete confidence in the Trump administration. They're doing everything that they should do to get the economy going. I don't feel I feel badly for the president and the governor of every state, because they've got to make a decision when to reopen, and it's a no-win situation. So if you open too early, a lot of people are going to die. You open too late, the economy is going to tank. That'll lead to massive unemployment. You'll end up with more drug use and crime and all these problems. So no matter what happens, you're going to lose. It's a no-win situation. I always say, if you're in a no-win situation, the next best thing to do is to look for the choice with the least losses. So if you can't win, look to minimize loss. I think minimizing loss, and you'll get a lot of disagreement with this, especially from medical professionals, I understand, but I think you'll be minimizing loss by opening the economy a little earlier rather than later, and just target the most at-risk people over 65, for instance, people with other chronic health issues. Let them be a little more quarantined, a little more careful with this. Let the rest of us open up. We will get through this, though. This time next year, the stock market will be back to where it was before. The economy will be growing. We'll have had a vaccine for this coronavirus, and we'll have some therapeutics. And I hope I'm not being overly optimistic.
Stay with us just a moment, if you would. Dr. Michael Busler is professor of finance at Stockton University in New Jersey. He has written columns for major newspapers for over 30 years, and you can find his current columnist work at Newsmax, Town Hall, The Western Journal, and Laura Ingram's Lifeset. And Michael, can our viewers reach you through social media? And if so, how?
Sure. Every one of my columns I tweet out. So that's at @mbusler. That's at @mbusler. And if you're on Facebook, I have a Facebook page called Funding Democracy. So just search Funding Democracy. You'll see every one of my columns. I'd be very happy if you follow me.
I'm going to put that in the chat box for all of our viewers.
Thank you for your time. Can we do it again?
Certainly my pleasure. I look forward to doing it again.
Great. We'd love to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Keith, that was impressive.
Yeah, he's an impressive guy. I mean, a wealth of knowledge and real-time experience, as he not only teaches finance at Stockton, but he works with businesses. Mm-hmm. And in a time like this, we've never been through, and those businesses have never been through anything like this. Absolutely fascinating.
So I'll throw this out to our audience. Is there any questions that you have that maybe didn't get answered today? And maybe we can just do our best to answer them and maybe give our take. I thought Michael did a fantastic job of looking at things. But yeah, please use the chat box to ask any questions. Keith, what was your takeaway from his conversation?
That we will come through this. I found it to be reassuring. And not that we haven't heard people say that before. And when we say we will come through this, so many different levels. Yes, many businesses may not come through this. Other businesses will most likely flourish. Mm-hmm. And it'll become very apparent which are which. But that's happened all through our history, with every change in technology, with changes in population and migrations and everything. But again, from his level as an economist, looking at things that I don't sit around and think about, he crunches all of that and says, yes, we will come through this. And then he put a time factor on it, saying in the third quarter, we're going to see growth. We're going to see better growth in the fourth quarter. And 2021, he said we could see the best growth in years. Mm-hmm. Well, keep in mind, we were doing 3%. The target was 4% growth, which is really can be argued by the Federal Reserve that's not a good thing. It's too fast of economic growth. Yeah, and he said the best in years. So 2021 may be so different in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, my big thing, and this is, again, I don't want to downplay and poo-poo anything that he said, because I thought it was massively intelligent. I mean, it's one individual's insights on what they are. However, I look at that and say that individual is in a spot that he would know that. And what is his quote unquote believability scale? And for me, it's like, wow, I want to go, as an example, I always think of, if I want to learn something new, I want to go to somebody that's the best at it. If I want to learn how to play tennis, I might try to see if Roger Federer could teach me how to play tennis. And so when we let's look at the economy, let's find the best and the brightest. And I thought Michael provided great insights on various things. The other thing that I think is interesting is some of the details that he brought up that we don't see a whole heck of a lot in the news. And that was specifically as it related to our the debt and what happens with the spending cuts and what happens with cutting taxes. It's interesting. It's like when you cut taxes, then more people are likely to utilize that, which actually generates more tax revenue than less. And then we then take that and frame that, and I think politicians unfortunately have a very high tendency and probability of doing this, is they then use those new numbers of how much tax revenue we generated and then apply them if we had only kept the tax rates the same. It's like putting something on sale and saying, oh my gosh, our sales went up tenfold. Had we only had it at the original price, we would have made X amount of dollars more. And it's like, that's just illogical. And so I start to think about that in the way that we see and consume news. Is statistics are lovely. I love numbers, but they also can be manipulated, and they can be, you can paint a story with any number. And so that is something that I would put to our audience, to you.
Presidential wealth management, securities, and investment advisory services are offered through Forta Financial Group, Inc., a registered broker-dealer, member FINRA and SIPC.